everyone, and you're listening to Transnatural Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Bennett, recording live from Oslo, Norway, and I thank you once again for tuning in as we continue our collective global journey of cultivating perspectives on society and culture across environments and landscapes. And that's right, I'm saying collective because it's you, it's me, and it's all our awesome guests, all in it together, keeping this experience going. We're currently transmitting this broadcast out to at least 37 countries on 6 continents. That's the count so far. That's a lot of transnatural perspective being shared. That's awesome. If you're just joining us for the first time, please remember to subscribe wherever you're listening right now so that you're alerted every time there's a new episode. And I'd also love to get some feedback on the episode, so make sure you follow us on social media and send us your comments between shows. Please share this podcast wherever you can, because really, that's the best way you can support it. Today, we will travel to Australia to speak with James T. Neill, who's an educational psychologist and professor at the University of Canberra. James' expertise and interests lie in outdoor education, adventure therapy, green exercise, experiential education, and some other indoor activities like online education, open education, psychology of social networking, and program evaluation. James is a pioneer in his research with Outward Bound and other adventure therapy programs as they relate to life skills, mental health, and adjustment to health and medical conditions. For those of you who have never heard of Outward Bound program before, Outward Bound is a leading provider of experiential and outdoor education programs for youths and adults around the world. This is an international network of outdoor education organizations that was founded in the United Kingdom by Lawrence Holt and Kurt Hahn back in 1941. Outward Bound helps shape programs like the U.S. Peace Corps and numerous other outdoor adventure programs. Its aim is to foster personal growth and social skills of participants by using challenging expeditions in the outdoors. James also has some pretty incredible adventures, including on the high seas in his efforts to collect data on the Outward Bound programs, a story he's going to share with us during the interview. You may also know James' work if you were ever a user of the Wilderdom outdoor education website, one of my favorites and a favorite among teachers looking for last-minute activities to share with their classrooms. I've personally been quite inspired by James' work for many years now, and for that reason we have a ton to talk about. We discuss a lot in this episode, so please take a look through the timestamps if you want more thorough summary. And we by no means covered the wide spectrum of James' identity as a researcher, but that's a great reason I hope to have him back again. And after listening, I think you will agree too. So that's it, everybody. Enjoy the episode, the conversation, and talk to you on the other side with some reflections. Very excited about today's guest, all the way from, I think I got it right, Canberra, Australia. Everybody, welcome to the show. James Neill, how are you doing today, James?
I am doing great, thank you. And pretty well pronounced, I've got to say. We probably say Canberra.
Canberra.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to have some kind of, when I was a kid, I liked to make up stories, and I had this whole thing where I was trying to convince people I was the foreign exchange student from Canberra, Australia, but I always had a very big interest in Australia. As we were talking before the show, I still haven't managed to get there. I've tried to get there a couple times, although it is one of these places, and I don't know if you've ever been to where I'm from, but I'm from Florida originally, South Florida, where we have the Everglades. And when I look at the nature in Australia, I always think, this might be one place in the world that looks quite similar to where I'm from, at least in terms of like wild animals and all these kinds of things. So I don't know. Have you ever been over to Florida or the Everglades before?
I have. I've been to the northeast, and I've been to like the New England area, and a little bit on the west, and a tiny bit down into Mexico. But I haven't made it to that corner.
Yeah, I always think, I mean, from what you can tell me better because I've never been there before, but when I think about Australia, of course, I think about crocodiles and all these like wild animals out in the bush that you definitely don't see here in Europe so much. Snakes.
And I guess that's the nature of an island, isn't it? That things evolve in their own unique direction, whether it's, Galapagos Islands or, a large island. That's the nature, I guess, of, a period of isolation. So, I mean, of course, it's not anything like what Crocodile Dundee, has you believe. We're a heavily urbanized population, but it's it's a massive country with remarkably few people. I think we're something like 0.3% of the world population. Like it's minuscule in terms of people, and yet the landmass is, surprisingly large. And yet we all concentrate together by and large, and live. Sydney and Melbourne have population densities that are equivalent to many of the large cities in the world.
Yeah, and of course, it's, from what I understand, the middle. I mean, most people, of course, live by the coastline. And then the middle is kind of a lot of desert and whatnot, kind of barren.
Yeah, and that, and it depends how far you sort of zoom in or zoom out. So zoom out, yes, it looks barren, and yet, Indigenous people have lived there and thrived for as long as any, they are probably the oldest continuing, Indigenous population, and they covered the whole country and, worked out how to live in that environment. So you spend time in that environment and, you see it remarkably differently.
Yeah, that's a very good point too. Of course, from the very, very far outsider, never been there, just looking at it on a map perspective, very probably colonial mindset too. We would say, oh, it looks very barren there, but of course, there's a lot going on there. People have been living there forever. Just to start off, to kind of introduce yourself, and also why we're joining together here on the podcast today. I first came acquainted with you quite a long time ago. I'd say probably back in, 2012, when I was doing a lot of research for my outdoor studies. I was studying in a program called Transcultural European Outdoor Studies. So very broad study and researching a lot of, interdisciplinary kind of outdoor studies, researching a lot of things, everything from psychology to anthropology, and how it all kind of connects through the outdoors. So I first came across your writings and research through my studies. And I mean, I noticed that, you go by many different topics that you're circulating around, like outdoor education, adventure therapy, green exercise, and then some things that are a bit broader, more into psychology, like program evaluation and cross-cultural adaptation. All of these words I'm just kind of pulling out of the ether that I'm connecting with your work that I've read. Is it safe to say you are an ecopsychologist?
Yeah, look, I probably struggle for a single identity, and
sure,
I'm a bit eclectic in that way, but I'm actually a bit of a fan of the sort of multiple identity literature. There's this narrative that you need to be a sort of a single personality or a single identity, and I actually think that's not necessarily healthy. I think multiple identity has a sort of bad name from psychopathology because there are disorders which are dysfunctional, but I actually suspect that at the other end of the spectrum, the healthiest psychological profile is one that can, embrace multiple identities, and we all have them. We behave differently at home with our family from how we behave at work or how we behave, in other contexts. So yeah, I mean, my first sort of, serious job was an outdoor education instructor with Outward Bound Australia, and when I was an adolescent and you go through that sort of identity search, and I thought that I probably wanted to go trekking in Nepal and go up a mountain and find, a guru on the mountain who would, I could sit with and, have the world kind of within and without kind of revealed. And I was always interested in psychology, and what made people tick, and in particular how people could be made to tick better. But I love sport, and I love, rambling around and, doing things with my body. So when I eventually went to uni, there was no such thing as outdoor education or all the sort of, even the course that you said you did, it sounds fascinating. I would have loved to have done that. I did psychology, and then I said, well, can I do philosophy? Because I thought, okay, well, maybe they're two things that would get close to what I want. And they kind of said, no, those two things don't go together. And that was the attitude then. I mean, it's completely different now where you make up your own degree, basically. So the closest I could get was to do psychology and sport, and that's what I did. But before that, I had gone to an information evening by Outward Bound Australia, and they gave a talk and they showed me a video, and I thought, that's it. Like, because it was the outdoor adventure packaged with the personal development, which was, the perfect combination of what I was looking for. And I went home and told my dad about this, and that's what I wanted to do. And would he cough up the money? And he said no. And I hated him for it, absolutely hated him for it. But he said, go out and earn the money yourself. And I probably owe him, I don't know if I've had the conversation with him, I probably owe him the conversation to say, well, I didn't like it at the time and I resented it, but thank you, because it did send me out on my own 2 feet. And because I grew up in Perth on the west, I came over to the east and picked fruit for 3 months and earned enough money to buy a pair of boots and a rain jacket and to pay for an Outward Bound course. And, that was sort of the beginning, I guess, of that part of the journey. And these days, I don't know why, I had a great time picking fruit because it was outdoors, it was natural. I'd catch a lift into town and go and, get books from the library about how they graft, fruit onto things. And it was all walks of people. Somebody warned me that, if you go fruit picking, you'll meet 3 types of people. You'll meet criminals, which was true. You'll meet overseas people, which was true. And what was the third category? I don't know. It might have just been drifters or something like that. And it was a wild place. I was pretty frightened at times, but, it was just awesome to be, I don't know. For me, I felt like my life had started, because it was adventure was happening, and that was as fit as I've ever been, running up and down ladders all day. I actually loved the payment system because it was what they call piecemeal. You get paid for what you pick. So if you want to sit around and drink cases of beer all day and pick a couple of apples and get paid a few cents, you can do that. And if you want to work 12 hours a day flat out and, you can earn reasonable money. And it was sort of like, in some ways, it was an ideal sort of utopia because you could do what you wanted and you got rewarded for it if you wanted to work hard. And if you wanted to party, then you partied. So, yeah, that was, and in many ways, that was just as important in my development as, subsequently then doing an Outward Bound course and then, starting to work as a Outward Bound instructor. And I was studying psychology along the way. And I think I used to ride my bike to uni every day. And every holidays, I would basically jump on the bus and I would come back to the east, which is like a 2-day bus trip, and work and then bus back for the first day of classes. But in my last year of uni, I went to hand in my last assignment. Instead of riding my bike that day, I must have been in a hurry. I jumped in the car and had a car accident. It wasn't a major one. Somebody ran into the back of me, but it was enough to give me whiplash. And so I couldn't really easily put a backpack on. And I let Outward Bound know that I probably wasn't in the best shape for going bush. And they said, well, you've just finished your psychology degree. How about you come over and you can get involved in the research department, which, was, when I say department, that was an executive director who himself had a real passion, Gary Richards, for outdoor education, personal development, but combining sort of research. And for him, that was integral to program development and staff development and development of participants. So I was very fortunate then to sort of, I guess, get on the other side. I think I had the previous year written him a somewhat cheeky, naive, upstart letter about, how there was a lack of evidence about these things working and why weren't people investigating it and blah, 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 which was probably, if I look back, highly embarrassing. But I think that also sort of put a bit of a seed in his brain that I was curious to, probe a bit deeper into what was going on.
I didn't mean to try to pigeonhole you either into like one thing. I don't like to label people, but it sounds to me like it is, very healthy to kind of like embrace all of these different kinds of avenues in like an interdisciplinary way. And it sounds like you just kind of like naturally evolved into that without, saying, oh, I'm going to go to school and be an eco-psychologist, or I'm going to go be a psychologist, or I'm going to study all these different kinds of things. It sounds like, kind of your father saying, all right, you want to do that, go out and get a job. And that puts you, what it sounds like to me, on this very, it got you motivated, in a very natural way, and doing these very natural and kind of physical things like picking fruit, like riding your bike all over the place to like save money, and then going off and being an outward bound instructor, and at the same time kind of balancing that out with the studies. And it sounded like it all just kind of melted together into this thing that you do now. When was that, when you had this accident, and then like what year was it? I'm just trying to gauge like what time period we're in.
Yeah, so I was born 1970, so this would now be early 1990s, late 80s, early 1990s. And when I was over there, I then did a honours degree. I then started a PhD while I was working at Outward Bound, and one of my sort of first sort of real frustrations was getting hold of information. It was out there, like it existed, but this is pre-internet, and it's difficult to sort of, for those of now that we've grown up in the internet, to actually sort of transport your mind back to what it's like. And in a way, I sort of imagined that the internet should exist, because that was my sort of attitude, that there should be this sharing, there should be availability. But most of the stuff that we were looking for, say, in those days, Outward Bound was kind of, it was sort of one of the first big organisations, and arguably it's sort of still the only real genuine international sort of network of outdoor education schools. So they had these little hothouses of, development, but very little was published, and a lot of it was just sitting in filing cabinets in various schools. So I think in the early 90s, let's see, it was the anniversary of Columbus's arrival in America, and there was some recreation. What would that have been? 500th anniversary? And
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah,
there you go, perfect. So 1992. So 1992, a whole lot of tall ships sailed from Europe to the US, and some Australian boats joined in. For them, it's a longer journey, so it became a sort of year-long exercise, circumnavigation. And the last leg was, actually would have been the second last leg, was Europe to the east coast of the US. And then there was a final leg from west coast of US back to Australia. And they divided it up into sort of 4 3-month segments. And I was kind of by then looking for another sort of Outward Bound experience. I'd wanted, it had been great. And so I ended up sort of getting a place on, youth crew coming back from the US. So I thought, okay, I'll go over to the US and visit some Outward Bound schools, try and extract their research from them. And I had a great time. I went to Thompson Island, Outward Bound School. I spent a month. I thought I may as well go to the schools that seem most different from what I was experiencing. So I figured there was not much point in going to, I don't know, California Outward Bound School, because they sort of did expedition things like what we did. So New York at that time was like, wow, that's really different kind of idea to do urban programs. How does this work? So I had a great month there and learnt huge amount. And then I went to the Outward Bound USA kind of centre up in New England, and basically sat there on the photocopier for days photocopying all their stuff, and had boxes of things that I, dragged down to Mexico, and then dragged onto the yacht that we were on, and then it sailed, across the ocean back to Sydney 3 months later for our Australia Day. So that was all time that, we would also come in on Australia Day, which kind of celebrates the Captain Cook, arrival in Australia. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the beginning, basically, for me, of the internet, because I had this stuff here and I wanted to kind of share it. And so then when the internet sort of popped up in the late 90s, I was, basically just putting as much info up there because I thought for anyone else like me who's been frustrated with trying to get a comprehensive look at, in that case, I was studying, what do we know about outward bound programs, then I just wanted it to be shared and available. And that was the birth of the Wilderdom website, which is now a kind of smoking, wrecking ruin, but it was my sort of brain dump and way of networking with the other people interested in similar ideas. Yeah, which has been awesome.
Yeah. Okay. So, wow, I'm gonna back up through this for a minute because this is a pretty incredible story. A few things like, wow. So to me, it sounds like, yeah, when you kind of got this idea to kind of start researching outward bound and like pulling everything together, you're saying there wasn't much research about these programs beforehand. So how were they? Nowadays everything is based on research and they want to see the research to get funding. They want to see the research to make this policy. How were they like designing these outward bound programs before that? What was that based upon?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? It's based on ideas, I guess, and experience. And, research is not the province of, PhD academics or professors or whatever. I mean, everybody does research. It's just a question of how formalized it is and I guess how sort of rigorous it is. And I mean, what I loved about the early stuff that at least we were doing at Outward Bound Australia was that it wasn't driven by sort of funding and it wasn't driven by anything other than a passion to sort of provide the best possible programs and to continue to try and evolve program methodology because, as Gary had said to me, if we're going to put this much time and effort and, people worked hard in those, I mean, they still work hard in the outdoors, don't get me wrong, but in those sort of pioneering days, getting paid next to nothing, working 7 days a week, no holidays, blah, blah, blah. If we're going to work this hard, then he wanted to be kind of assured that it was actually having any effect because if it wasn't, then we should be doing something different. But like, like one of the experiments I remember was, we hooked up with a doctor from the hospital who himself was a former outward bound instructor, and we were interested in sort of stress and, how it changed over the month-long program because an outward bound program includes periods of high intensity, but it also includes, 3 days of solo, for example. And, stress is this double-edged sword and that's a sort of Kurt Hahn metaphor that it, outward bound sort of cuts and heals at the same time. And it's a bit like risk. It's, you're kind of playing with fire a little bit when you intentionally set out to challenge someone because you can go too far physically, psychologically. At the same time, you cannot go far enough. And so there was a desire to sort of learn a bit more about that, I guess, optimal stress point. Anyway, this guy, James Van Gelder, came out and said, okay, well, if you want some data about this, you've got all your questionnaires and whatever, but you probably should get some physiological data as well. And at the time, the way to do that seemed to be through urine samples because you can detect cortisol in the urine samples. So just because it was logistically easier, it was decided to do it with males rather than females. So for this month-long course, the males were all issued with must have been like 4-litre bottle, plastic bottle that you would hang off the back of your backpack. But everything had to go into that bottle. And at the bottom of the bottle, there was some sort of acid because it needed, I don't know why, it needed to be, neutralized or stored in some way. So there were splashback issues that a few people complained about. And then males can become a bit competitive. So it also became a challenge to see, could you fill up your 4-litre bottle in your 24 hours? And then we'd get to a sort of a checkpoint and we'd hand our bottles over and James or someone would be there he had to have a freezer ready to pipette the water, to pipette the urine in solar-powered kind of freezer, and he would take those samples off to the hospital and gather the data that way. And then it was later that I actually learnt data analysis from, James in some ways, because he'd work all day in the hospital, and then he said, "Look, come in," because I was meant to be doing research, and I'd find my way into the basement of this hospital, and he'd be there, and he was. I just sort of sat there and watched what seemed to me at the time like this wizard kind of. In those days, it's not Windows-based, analysis. It's somebody typing in, code to analyze data and so on, and I just sat there with my sort of jaw on the floor that somebody could just have that kind of skill level to manipulate data and extract, patterns and things like that, which I found, quite inspiring. So, it was a bit of sort of, there's things that you can't get away with it in outdoor education now, ethically, that you can't get away with. You need ethics proposals for all your research and that sort of stuff. But some of the adventure, a bit like some of the classic psychology experiments, could not in a million years be acceptable these days. We were allowed to sort of gather whatever kind of data we liked at the time, and basically every participant that went through the programs for, over a 10-year period got kind of poked and prodded and analysed, only some of which, was ever sort of led to, formalised publications, but it was all being kind of churned back into the program and the program development.
Wow. So it sounds to me like, as you said, before this kind of research that you were doing began, of course, there was different types of research going on that kind of built up these outward bound programs. But I mean, to me, it sounds like, in a way, you're kind of a pioneer in this field, because, I mean, I'm amazed by your story that you went on these tall ships and like literally went out and collected all of this like raw materials, all these surveys and information from all these outward bound courses around the world. And then you kind of brought that back and mixed it with your psychology background. And I think this is important too for a lot of people to consider, because I was always very curious how you got into this, just reading your work. And I think like a lot of people, when they hear outdoor studies, like when I tell somebody, okay, I studied outdoor studies, they say, okay, what is that? And for me, all of this, I mean, I don't know, for me, in reality, everything is connected to the outdoors. We are all connected to the environment, the ecology, all this kind of stuff. So it's more about like what you bring into that venue. And in this case, you had this like specific set of interests and skills. And so that's pretty wild. And I mean, how is your research playing a role, nowadays in these outward bound programs?
Yeah, look, I mean, just like programs have, blossomed and flowered and diversified, and, like it's a good thing that Outward Bound is just really a speck in the ocean of outdoor type programs now, because of course it wasn't the only thing. There's Scouts and there's other sorts of program. People are always doing interesting things, and I mean, when I go to conferences, I'm still amazed at that. I swear there are no two programs that are the same, and I think it's amazing and fascinating and great. I mean, it's kind of challenging, because when people ask for some sort of evidence or whatever, the research on one program may have zero relationship to another program. A picture might look similar, but the actual process of the program is radically different. And I think it's awesome that there's so many kind of live experiments going on and in the field. So I think research is the same. Like there's so many people doing, so many different little things, and I find it all, all fascinating to be. And yeah, the diversity of perspectives is just kind of fascinating.
Did you find, when you were doing these cortisol tests, did you find a certain sweet spot for stress?
Well, I mean, like nothing's ever that simple, of course, but, one of the things that I remember is that when, heart rate monitors got put on people going up into high ropes courses, and there was starting to be a bit of concern at the time that, there was put an older person up there was the odd heart attack, on a ropes course or something like that. What's going on here? And it turns out in that case that heart rate's at peak. Say if you're at the top of a zip line or flying fox, we call it in Australia, it's before you leave that the heart rate peaks. So that's actually physiologically the most dangerous moment, not actually, zipping down. So the same would go for a rappel or abseil, which sort of fits with our experience. Like if you're talking someone down a rappel, generally speaking, in fact, this was the very first thing I ever published, and it was sort of a pilot study for my honours study, there were some experiments that have been done with parachuting where, just before somebody jumped out of the plane with their parachute, they would fill out on a pretty simple visual kind of scale how kind of stressed do you feel, and a couple of other questions, fold it up, pop it in their pocket, jump out of the plane, land on the ground, pull it back out of their pocket, and mark these couple of questions again on how they felt at the bottom. And you could then look at you're getting some insight, I guess, into the change or the process that occurs from the beginning to end of a challenge like that. And so in that little pilot study, for my very first research study, we just drew a visual picture of the cliff and had a couple of simple questions, which included mark on here where you found the cliff the abseil most difficult, mark the point where you found that it suddenly became a lot easier for you, that sort of breakthrough moment, as well as sort of how stressed were you or how confident were you at the start, and then at the bottom, how confident, were you, or a couple of things like that. And what that allowed us to do was just sort of draw a graph of people's experience. And of course, there's individual differences. It's not the same for everyone, but there is enough of a pattern there to kind of go that what I found from that was the most stressful point for most people is actually just over the edge, which also turns out to be just the point, if you're top belaying, at which you lose sight of the person that you're talking down. And because visual contact is so important, that especially inexperienced instructors had this tendency that once they saw them disappear over the edge, they sort of tuned off and turned around and started chatting to other people. And yet participants are saying, this is actually the moment, because that's actually when you're going from, somewhat vertical to fully horizontal and having to fully rely on the, rope and not just your feet, that's actually the critical point that people, are psychologically freaking out. And therefore, it's actually the most critical point to still be available to them. So, that's just, for me, that's just a simple example of where some data actually then can change the way you sort of train your instructors and the way you interact and facilitate with participants. And I think that's just the basic principle for me is, we've got our intuitions and we've got our own ideas, and that's all, good and great. But when it involves other people and ethical responsibility and wanting to provide, the best possible experience, then why wouldn't you be just as interested to get just as much information about what's actually going on for people psychologically and physically that in these experiences that you take them through?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm really glad that, you and other people are actually getting a lot of hard psychological data. This begs the question, why are people doing things like this anyways, like abseiling? Why are people attracted to these super activities? Why do people, want to? I just have so many questions about this, and it all kind of roots back to how I originally found out about you, which is through this idea of the Intra-Indigenous consciousness that I've seen you mention before. Where did that idea come from? And can you explain it to us a little bit in your own words, the intra-Indigenous consciousness?
Yeah, look, it's not my term, but
where did this term come from then? Because I've had a really hard time finding more information on this.
Yeah. Look, so I learned about this idea from a fellow named Graham Ellis Smith, who grew up he was older than me, grew up in Perth, and he became a park ranger in that area. But he he was a bit bored, and he wasn't sort of challenged enough. So he said to them, "Look, can you please send me to the most remote, faraway national park? I don't want to be around, those even anywhere near the cities." So, which was a bit unusual because most people are wanting to go in the other direction. And so they sent him off into northwestern Australia, and he got to know Indigenous people up there, and they basically accepted him into their community, and he went through some of their rituals, and he was fully accepted and trusted by them. And so the concept comes from that community through their conversations with Graham. And they actually asked him, they said, "Look, eventually go away because we actually want you to start talking to other people about what's going on." And one of their messages to him was, get over this idea that, we're Indigenous and you're not. Everybody's Indigenous. Like, everybody came from somewhere. The issue is that for, those of us who come from, colonial kind of histories, we're several generations distanced from, where our ancestors came from. And we've lost connection with that. So my heritage is Indigenous to Ireland, UK area. And so Graham started running a few workshops, and he came over to the east, and I went to one of his workshops. Must have been 2004 or something like that, 2003. And he used a combination, I guess, and it probably was you'd probably call it now ecopsychology, because it wasn't wild and adventurous. It was actually quite slow and methodical. And really, he just took us through a series of Indigenous kind of exercises. It was a combination of Australian but also North American things, and things like sort of identifying your totem, which was a North American thing, and really tuning into plants, like just spending time holding our hands over plants and trying to feel the energy, coming from plants. And really the message of that was go and rediscover your own indigeneity, and probably to do that experientially. That was what I took from it. Like, here's some techniques, and they can be interesting, but ultimately, the story of indigeneity is sort of stored within our genetics, and it is there. And when you say, well, why are people, why are properties on the coast overlooking the ocean more expensive than properties that aren't? Like, there's a whole lot of reasons they shouldn't be, right? It's windier, it's saltier, it's riskier, it's all of this, and yet they're the highest priced properties because there's some, people like it. People like walking on the beach. People like, looking out at the ocean. So, this probably the closer thing that you would have come across is, the biophilia hypothesis, the idea that we are naturally attracted to nature and nature-like features because, that was where we evolved, and effectively where, animals that have been domesticated, and we live in, urban zoos, so we feel, slightly uncomfortable, and even if that's not conscious, it is sort of working away unconsciously. So I guess that's, and so you mentioned the green exercise stuff, for example, which is really nothing more than saying we know that physical activity is good for people physically and mentally. We know because there's studies like the original Kaplan window in the hospital studies, which showed that patients who had a window looking out onto something natural would recover faster and spend less time in hospital than those looking at a blank wall or looking at an abstract painting. And that was probably the first psychological study that clearly demonstrated that there's some intrinsic value to, in that case, just passively looking at nature. And then if you go, well, let's actually sort of be fully in nature, or if you go further and say, let's do activities in nature, then, you can get even more benefits. So green exercise is really just saying, well, if we know physical exercise is beneficial, if we know that being in nature is beneficial, if we do physical exercise in nature, do we get, even more bang for our buck, which, seems to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm a 100% huge fan and promoter of getting outside as much as possible. And I don't know, never been a fan of the gym so much. More because of the environment than, it's interesting. It feels good to go to the gym. Like, you do get some benefit out of that. And I don't know if you've ever looked into this, but I mean, the ultimate thing that ever, inspired me to start digging deeper into the outdoors is just that feeling that you get when you're outside, when you get the fresh air, when you're moving your body, and you're around, the green things and the dirt and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, that just inspires to go deeper into these things where a gym just, I don't know. I feel like stuff like this creates a lot of benefit for some people, but, a large part of the population, especially people that like go to, get a gym membership during the holidays or something, never end up using it. I don't know the statistic, but I know most people don't end up using those gift certificates to the gym, or they use it for like a month and then never go out. But it seems to me with like green exercise, there's so many things you can do. You just got to find something that you enjoy doing, and it's going to bring a lot of benefit for you. And it doesn't cost any money usually, and can be very low impact and doesn't need a lot of equipment if you choose to do something that's very kind of like low key outdoor activity.
Yeah, spot on. And I think, as I sort of moved through my outdoor education career and, came out of it and looking more back on it, one of the reflections is, look, a month long or a week long or whatever, some sort of, multi-day experience is probably great. And there's a huge number of people that are very, very, very convinced that the longer the better. And that used to be one of the most common email questions I would get is, can you send me evidence to show that longer is better? And when we did the meta-analysis in 1997, which, like, almost all of these projects, other people's initiative. I just, happened to have, gone along for the ride. And that was a fellow named John Hattie, who's one of the top educational psychologists in the world. His wife had done a master's, and she was looking at, I think it was like physically based sort of intervention programs in schools or something like that. And they had included some outdoor education data. And it had popped up on their sort of radar that, wow, there's some pretty impressive results coming from these programs. And he then got in touch with us at the Outward Bound School and said, hey, you got more research there. Can we come and have a look? Blah, blah, blah. And he came down for a couple of days. And a bit like this story with James Van Gelder, I then sort of watched this guy, because a meta-analysis is not one study, it's pulling together tens, hundreds, thousands of studies and kind of processing them to try and find the overall trends. And he'd already gathered a whole lot of published literature, but he came down to us, spent a couple of days, and we were just sort of feeding him data and information, like literally, on one computer coming up with some results and printing them out and calling them out to him, and he's there pumping them into his computer. And I think that study ended up with, was it 197 studies or 97? It certainly had the 97 in it. It was one of the two. And, that was the first meta-analysis of, the research. So by then the research had grown enough that you can actually sort of pull it together into, one larger study. But when we put in length of program had a pretty small, it was a positive relationship with outcomes, but it had a pretty small relationship and not much to get all that excited about. And then subsequently, there's green exercise research coming out now, and they've tried to look for the same thing, is more better? And same sort of thing, like, yeah, probably, but really the take-home message is even a brief, small dosage of green exercise is you get a fair bit of bang for your buck from that. And so I actually think the narrative should be the opposite of, well, I mean, don't get me wrong, long expeditions are great, but one of the messages that needs to go out is just go outside for 5 minutes. Just go outside at lunchtime and take a 15-minute walk around the park, because you'll get a shot. You get a really positive mental health kind of shot from that can flow through, over time. So, and because we're only going to have a very small number of, let's face it, largely quite privileged people going on fairly resource-intensive expeditions, then that's not any real solution to anything on a large scale. Whereas, planting some more trees in the local neighbourhood, and so that there's a green sort of walkway that many people can access, that's going to service so many more people.
Yeah, I think that this is a big thing. I can imagine a lot of people are realizing, especially nowadays during these COVID kind of lockdown quarantine times, where you have such a limited opportunity to, go on long journeys or anything like that right now, especially because maybe that takes some transportation that you don't want to take right now, or maybe, you just live in a highly urbanized area and you just can't get to these places. Is that, just even, for example, I have a roof here where you can go out on the roof. Even just going out there for 5 minutes to get some fresh air between doing some work, and you're just like, why haven't I been out here like 5 hours ago already? Why? Or people will like sit in bed during the day and be, it's a little stormy outside. I don't know if I feel like going out right now. And then immediately you go outside and you're like, it's actually not so bad out here right now. It feels much more refreshing to get that and massively improved. And I mean, that's just another thing that originally spurred my interest to just get into the outdoor studies in general, because it's just like, what is that feeling? And of course, we're all exploring it in different ways. You're exploring it from this very like data-driven psychology perspective. And there's just many ways you can pursue that. It made me think about too, when you're talking about this study of looking out the window, because I saw you were doing something about like cat pictures and how this affects your emotion.
Yeah.
And I was I was looking at that for a few minutes, and I thought, but this to me reminds me of that idea of, if you look at pictures of nature and stuff like that, it also can affect your emotions. Did you see any like connections between like cat pictures and, essentially a cat picture is kind of a nature picture if you're looking at it, something that is kind of what is that because I think what I'm trying to get at here is that when I think about going back to this idea of the intra-Indigenous consciousness, and I'm glad that you also clarified where that originally comes from, this Graham Ellis, right? Because that sets the score there. But to me it seems like with this intra-Indigenous consciousness idea, we have this body, we have this way of moving, we have this machine. And it's engineered to do certain things. It's engineered to bend down and pick up berries and throw rocks and, pull branches down from trees and pick up babies and whatever, human bipedal kind of things. But nowadays, to me, it seems like we've, become drastically disconnected. We sit in cars, we sit at desks, we sit at all these things. And I'm just wondering, have you seen any evidence of like, this is kind of like a misdirected kind of energy? We have this energy inside of us as humans, as these like human animals, to express ourselves through our kind of indigenous movements, our movements that are indigenous to our bodies. And I just saw kind of like a parallel with that, with maybe like the cat pictures and the nature pictures. Like, we should be outside looking at nature, and nature really gives us the endorphins or maybe the happy juice that we need, but we can also derive that through other avenues, Does that resonate with any idea? Because that's kind of what I got from that.
Yeah, sure.
That's just my interpretation.
I'm laughing because it's always fascinating to me. You like throw something on the internet and, it just sort of disappears. And then occasionally it's a bit like sending out, a signal to find out if there's life in the universe. And occasionally some of it actually bounces back. And it's always fascinated me to see what bounces back. And when I first put up the Wilderdom site, I used to, because you can get your data analytics and stuff like that, so you can look and see what are people hitting on. And what I learned was that stuff that I'm passionate about is actually not what most people were looking for, which it's a rude shock when you find that, right? Because all of our passions are not more interesting to other people; they're more interesting to us. And what I learned from sort of looking at that is that what people were hitting was group activities and group games and team building exercises. Because for every one outdoor researcher or instructor out there, there's 100 people or 1,000 people going, damn, I've got to run an activity at my next conference or something, or I've got to do a bit of team building with my group. What's a quick activity I can do? And it was not actually something that I ever really knew about that much, because when you've got a sort of, I guess, a rich environment and an expedition-based program, you don't necessarily need to do a huge amount of group activities. But one of the things I sort of learnt about in the States was this whole kind of project adventure thing, which is a good example of a spin-off from Outward Bound that sort of became its own thing and went in its own direction. But the narrative is kind of
adventure-based counseling kind of stuff.
Yeah, but Carl Rohnke, who I might say just passed away only in the last month or so, who was, had been an Outward Bound instructor, when he had the same sort of idea, like, not everybody's going to do this, so how can more people get access to this experiential challenge kind of stuff? And so he said, and he also hated sport, absolutely loathed it. So when he went back into high schools and went into the PE curriculum, the very last thing he wanted to do was anything like any kind of conventional sport. And he was a really brilliant, creative kind of mind. And so for him, a basketball was not a basketball. It was like, what creative and interesting and fun and crazy thing can we do with a basketball that is not basketball? Yeah. So really that's where like low ropes activities and sort of low initiatives became, a thing. And because, maybe the activities weren't quite as powerful, that's where sort of some of the facilitation and framing of activities and metaphorical kind of, this isn't just a few, bits of wood on the ground. There's alligators and there's, crazy things that you're trying to step through, and, all of sort of this almost sort of storytelling, type scenario stuff. And that kind of opened my eyes a bit and other things to sort of, I guess, the role of facilitation. And, there's a great paper still from the must have been the Colorado Outward Bound School on, Thomas James, Can the Mountains Speak for Themselves? And it kind of talks about this philosophical debate in the Outward Bound schools at the time, because the early programs were, you just went out there, you had a hard, tough adventure, and, that was sort of it. And then there was a newer school coming in going, well, that's not enough, or we can do better than that. The mountains don't just speak for themselves. We need to sort of help people to process and think about this experience. And there's good arguments on both sides. And when I went over to interview for a job at Uni of New Hampshire with Mike Gass, and they said, come over and, you need to teach a class or whatever. Because I'd never done any – I taught some psychology at uni, but I hadn't taught outdoor education at uni. And that was actually the paper I picked up. And I thought, this is a really good philosophical debate. And, the exercise that we did that worked well and I sort of used it since was essentially – I can't remember in detail, but it was basically, embrace this debate and come up with a model that – I guess finds a solution to the problem. Like, if we don't want it to be purely mountains speak for themselves, but we don't want to be overly humanly interventionist, how do you create a model that kind of embraces the best of both worlds? And, in small groups, they went off at having sort of read the paper and debated this, and then come back and presented some new models that could go beyond that kind of dichotomy.
I see in your work, you talk a lot about motivation. Do you see any connections between like what our bodies are engineered to do and what our bodies are actually doing, and like how maybe that results in less sustainable choices?
for me, part of what you're saying relates back to this debate around, can the mountains speak for themselves, or do we have to sort of, can we just sit in a room and have deep and meaningful conversation with somebody else? And there's no doubt in my mind that the lack of physicality is absolutely an issue in first world, privileged societies, and for an increasing proportion of the population. I mean, ironically, it's the opposite for a bunch of people. Life is physically so bloody tough that there is just not enough nutrition, and so. And look, I was young and sort of naive and a bit, I would say what I thought. And when I was in the US, and Australia is like, I just sort of saw US as 10, 20 years ahead of Australia in good and bad ways. And one of those was obesity, and the quality of the food, and everything was made of corn syrup, and it was a culture shock. And I made the mistake of going to the US thinking, another English-speaking country, should be pretty similar. And what I learnt quickly was I should have made the opposite assumption, that I'm going into a completely different culture on so many different levels, and food is just sort of one of those. And I remember saying to, I think, my boss, and that, and it was a throwaway line, but, what we needed was a pipeline from the US to Africa, which you could send fat down, because, send energy down, because there was an excess sitting on people in the US, and and it's an awful stereotype and maybe even racist, I don't know, but, there was people starving in Ethiopia, and I just go, you look at it and you go, that doesn't make sense. Like, that's obviously not right. So, we've got kind of both problems. You've got the developing world that need better roofs over their houses and electricity and, that sort of stuff. And then we've got the privileged kind of world with excess and, heavily underutilized bodies. And it's difficult to deal with mental health and the mental health epidemic or crisis or whatever you call it. But the stats, there's various reasons why. Is it just being reported more, or are people actually, experiencing more depression, anxiety, stress? It's like, how can it be that we can have so many resources and yet, according to at least mainstream data, be psychologically less healthy? And to try and think that we can become optimally psychologically healthy without also doing the, physical component, I think is a little naive.
Yeah, well, I think in your analogy of the pipeline, what's up with the distribution of resources? The world does have enough to provide for everybody. It's just being kind of stored in some places, tossed out in other places, and then, not being sent or being sent away from other places. And I'm just wondering, like, do you see anything, because you work so much with psychology and people's like nature connectedness, do you see anything through your studies that lead like evidence between like why people continue to participate in unsustainable activities that would not really make any sense or like coincide with survival? Like, we're working in many ways with like climate change and a lot of just our daily activities that are creating climate change. We're really working against, in many ways, our own survival. But at the same time, isn't our whole goal to survive? And what's the disconnect there?
Yes, we're sort of shitting on our own island. I do think about, this sort of whole climate change discussion, issue, problem, challenge, phenomena, and I think, for example, outdoor education definitely needs to evolve. I think in many ways it was a 20th century thing, and it's been commercialized and commodified and sort of sausage factoried and that sort of thing. And what doesn't make sense to me is, I guess maybe we're at this sort of, hopefully, at this transition point where the future needs to be people who have learnt how to live sustainably. I mean, that's obvious. So if that's the case, surely the education pathway would be a curriculum of sustainable living skills. And that can be completely across the curriculum, but that can be the overarching goal. And I mean, it's pretty much, I don't know whether it's happening, but like the sustainable development goals seem to me like the obvious educational curriculum, because if that's sort of what we agree on as how we need to move forward, then presumably throw away the school curriculum, put in the sustainable development goals, and you're trying to exit students who are fully capable of contributing in some way, shape, or form to those sustainable development goals, and then build all your maths and English and science and whatever around that curriculum. So, I think a good policy decision could be, like in Australia, to offer, grants for farmers who need to improve their property to come and have school kids come onto their property and start to build sustainable living communities, rather than trek them through the bush and things like that with backpacks, which I don't know a zero carbon outdoor education program. Now probably somebody has made one out there, and I'd love to sort of see it. I'd love to see the analysis that says this is a genuinely zero carbon program. So I would suggest that all of what we sort of admire on the surface about these outdoor programs are in and of themselves not, contributing to the very problem that we're sort of saying that we need to find a way through and around. So if we sort of said, look, here's some grants for a zero carbon educational program. If you can show us that you're carbon positive in your program, then here's some money, run it. And I don't think it would be that hard. I mean, one of the most impressive outdoor education schools or stories that in Australia was started by a guy named Ian Stapleton, and all he did was go and find a cheap, as far as I know, a cheap bit of property with nothing on it, probably old farmland. There was no road access, and he said, right, we're open. And from day one, students had to, go across a zip line, cross their property, carry all their food, all their gear over to the other side, and then they were on the other side and stuck on the other side. And the first groups just started making stuff and building stuff for the following groups to come through. And they would go and do little hikes and things like that and other activities. And over time, they built a simple kind of school and facilities, and it still runs today. But I just think it's such a brilliant kind of concept and story that you can start with nothing. And one of my favourite quotes is from Ian Stapleton, and he said something like, if you can't do outdoor education with a backpack and a bit of water, then you can't do outdoor education. This idea that you've got to have kayaks and high ropes courses and blah, 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 it's really unnecessary if the process is there.
Yeah, I remember this famous story, well, famous to me, from one of my professors who was from Australia, but I can't remember which one now. And they told me, they had these programs going on. They lived by the coast, and they had these outdoor programs going on where every year they would drive all the way out to 6 hours out to some river to go kayaking. And then eventually they said, but then we realized we can just go surfing right here by the coast. It's not a traditional, stereotypical, outdoor education activity to go surfing, but it's much more, place oriented and obviously much more carbon neutral and natural to the area. And I really think this is what we need. We need people doing more low key activities. I mean, if we can't promote that in outdoor education or environmental education, all this kind of stuff, and also activities where you're reflecting, if you're doing organized activities where you're integrating, as teachers or facilitators, kind of a reflection process. I used to live up here at like the ski downhill ski area here in Oslo. And, year after year after year, I just see tons of kids, going down. And I mean, they're having fun. It's a good thing, being joyful out in nature. But I'm just thinking, there's no real reflective part here. It's more just like pay the money, ride the rail, got the equipment, got the flashy clothes. And I'm just like, where is this nature it's less and less snow every year. And we're not talking about why there's less and less snow every year, why we can't have ski class right now, because it didn't snow this year in Norway, which is we had no snow last year here. So yeah, but I think this is kind of just like, I think a lot of people are concerned. People are beating their heads against the wall about this kind of, black hole in the education system.
Yeah, when the climate change thing first started, I don't know, becoming, more mainstream, and I actually still feel this way, and it's not probably a popular view, but I was kind of like, bring it on, because whether it was true or not or whatever, because it was obvious to me that we weren't living sustainably, and whether that's whether it's going to be the heat or changing climate that is the driver, or just running, like at the time it seemed to me we're just going to run out of resources. So better than if it starts hurting earlier, the sooner and harder it hurts, to me, the better the long-term outcomes are. Because if it is a slow thing, and it has been slow, right, but it's sort of ticking up, you get this sort of frog in the pot, boiling and not realizing that it's boiling, and until it's too late. So this, I guess I sort of have this dual attitude, which is partly like, bring it on, because the more we hurt now, the better, the more likely we are to react, and it's going to need significant force. And you even see what COVID's done. I mean, I've had the best year of my life, thanks to COVID. Now, again, I don't wish it on, anyone, and I know it's, I'm in a privileged position. I can work from home and blah, blah, blah. But to me, there's been so many silver linings, and you mentioned sort of exploring your local place. It's like, really, do people, what is it on the other side of the world that I really, really need to, jump on a plane and fly over and see? That when I probably, we've had people locked down into 5 kilometre radiuses in Melbourne, and I'll be fascinated to see, but I bet they have got to know their local environment way better than they ever would have, because they've been asked to, explore a 5 kilometre radius in their lives. Yeah, this local stuff is, I think, critical, and it's the La Trobe University is sort of runs the largest outdoor education course, teaching course in Australia. It's in Victoria near Melbourne. And they were the ones who, once I sort of left the Outward Bound thing, and the Outward Bound thing is, in fact, one student said to me one time, pulled me aside, really concerned, I've got to chat to you in the first few days of the program. And I said, yeah, okay, what is it? He sort of, in a hushed voice said, you've been caught up in a cult. He said, you've got this community that lives apart from everyone else. You've got this charismatic leader that you all, think is wonderful. And he said, you've got to get out, And I was like, oh, that's not true, blah, blah, blah. But it really played on my mind, because I thought, he does actually have a point, and it did make me think. And when I eventually sort of left Outward Bound and got on the outside and looked back in, I could sort of see it through that lens. And I forgot where I was going with this, but
also he was saying that Outward Bound is the cult.
Yeah, that's right. So, I know the La Trobe thing. So when I sort of came out, what I found was, the La Trobe academics at the time had a critique that I had never seen of Outward Bound, of being now at the time they probably weren't using the words colonial, but it's this sort of macho, let's put on the backpacks, let's conquer nature. And in all that time at Outward Bound, I really never learnt the name of a plant. I never learnt the name of a star that I looked at. I never learnt any Indigenous history of the landscape that I walked through. And a bit like this international travel, we just sort of dropped into these little mini oases around the country, had a 1 or 2 day kind of tour, and a bunch of other strangers arrived. And as a group of strangers, we kind of, rambled through the bush, and hopefully you got something out of it, but we really learnt nothing about the environment. And the La Trobe Uni point was that maybe going slower, and maybe going more local, and maybe going to that same place more than once in different seasons, and getting to know it and build a relationship with it, that might be more important. And they had a much stronger environmental kind of education perspective. And for them, it was more about the relationship with nature and getting to know a place and getting sort of out of our sort of human consciousness into, and they weren't calling it Indigenous, but they were probably the first ones who started saying, well, yeah, let's get a bit of information from Indigenous elders and have them walk with us and, learn about the landscape and the history of it and things like that. And so it's a little bit like this, can the mountains speak for themselves versus, facilitation dilemma or debate is, do you go with this sort of slower, place-based, multiple visit type approach, or this, grand adventure type approach?
Yeah, I guess this is nowadays, kind of morphed into place-based learning, low impact activities. Have you ever come across this attraction to charismatic megafauna where, in the animal rights circles, we're really concerned about Shamu, we're really concerned about the blue whale or the big black bear, or whatever. And I see that a lot in outdoor activities too, or just like physical activity. And it maybe kind of the opposite of green exercise too, is this charismatic mega activities where, we gotta jump out of the plane and ski down the side of the tallest mountain or make it up to Everest. But I find, at least in just my own anecdotal kind of like, experience on tours with, groups, is that, it seems to me there's like a tendency for a lot of people that really want this excitement and this adrenaline and all this kind of stuff. It's very difficult sometimes, especially in group scenarios, to slow down and kind of stick together in that kind of community. So you always have to be kind of on top in front, this kind of stuff. And do you ever come across anything, or have you just ever thought about why people are attracted to these really charismatic mega activities as opposed to just like the simple kind of place-based local activities?
Absolutely agree with you. Yeah, I think there's, again, lots of answers to that. But I think part of it is this sort of masculinity, this Western masculinity thing, and this sort of colonial, conquering type approach that is historically embedded in outdoor education. And so I think when you sort of look at the ecological view and the feminist view and the eco-feminist sort of thing, or the Indigenous kind of approach is much slower and deeper, but
that's kind of what I got.
So it's kind of a cultural thing, I guess, because that has become a culture, or at least a subculture. And because you do have the outdoor activity, recreation, field, which, people like sort of high adrenaline type activities. And even if you don't like the physicality of it, you might want to go on a gondola or a Ferris wheel, or, like people like to be taken to that edge and experience that sort of emotionality that comes with being on the edge. But yeah, it's a somewhat sort of misguided narrative. I think now it's, it's not, to me, it's not a 21st century program model to, like, it'll always be there, and there's always going to be camps for thrills and spills and water slides and things like that. But the risk is that I guess, limits. I mean, I don't really think it is. There's lots of people out on the edge doing other interesting things, but it's probably what the general public thinks of as, as your typical outdoor program.
Recreation. I love this word, especially when you break it up. I just like playing around with words. Recreation, recreation. I don't know if there's any connection, but have you seen anything about in your time studying in this field? Have you seen anything that we recreate through recreation?
I mentioned going to the New York Outward Bound School, and then, although I never went there, the other Outward Bound School that popped up that just had a really different story was the Czech Republic school. So before they were a republic and they were, occupied by the communists, they had this, you couldn't do things in obvious ways. You had to do things in less obvious ways. So they had a program there, which was a drama-based program, but it was a personal development program through dramatic activity. And then when the Iron Curtain kind of came up and they became a republic, this sort of group looked around and sort of said, oh, well, who are we? Like who else out there is like us, and who do we belong to? And they ended up adopting Outward Bound. And so they said, well, yeah, that's the closest to what we do, because we challenge people, we want them to grow and develop, and so that's where we belong. We don't really use the outdoors, but that's not the point. Like in that sort of Outward Bound model, the outdoors actually doesn't really belong. It just happens to be a conducive environment to achieving what they set out to do. And so this Andy Martin from New Zealand wrote his thesis on the dramaturgy program at the Czech school. And again, I found it fascinating. And they had some really interesting activities, like wake people up at 3 a.m. and say, grab your sleeping bag and, come to this place. And now get into your sleeping bag, pull it down over your head. And they then took them through this sort of dramatic exercise that says, and they say, you are in the womb and you are about to, it's almost time for your birth, but we'll tell you a little bit about your mum and dad and the world you're about to come into, but you are about to get born. So get ready to, be born. And this would play out over hours. And so people would then, emerge from their sleeping bags and be born. And, if you look at stuff like the rebirthing program, like they take people back through an experiential, process to re-experience their birth on the assumption or the basis that, that you could resolve some issues by kind of doing that. And then gradually they take people through, bring them around little bottles and feed them, and here's your milk, and, you can't move, roll around on the ground, and, hey, you've worked out that you can start crawling around, and, they all crawl around and sort of bump into each other. And anyway, this whole process goes on that, eventually they can walk, and, they say, okay, here's the school, you got to come over and, sit down here and, do your lessons. And then different things start happening to different individuals, like, sorry, you got sick, off you go to the hospital over there, and, that person's got to go over there. So different things start happening. And basically it's sort of a life cycle thing. So they take people right through sort of a lifetime in the space of 2 or 3 hours, and they get to, death and things like that. They end up doing different jobs and things. And because it's a drama-based program, they sort of free up people's, encourage them, be free, like, don't be constrained. This is the place apart. You can experiment. You can be different, which is a message we used to try and give at Outward Bound. Like, if it doesn't work being this way over this month, that's fine. Go back and be who you were, but you may as well experiment with being someone else while you're here. So when you sort of say recreate, that's probably not what somebody would call recreation, but there is so much potential for, I guess, doing things that are different from just what people do every day, and in that way learning something about ourselves. And in some ways that's all this outdoor stuff is. But from the sort of humanistic psychology movement in the 1960s, you've got lots of experiments with how to be different ways, whether it's psychedelic drugs or, they really got into the group, the group encounter, group therapy programs. Let's just have marathon sessions and sit here together in a group for, 24 hours, 36 hours, and we're just going to talk until we get over all our barriers and preconceptions, and we'll go through frustration and anger and all of that. And then when we've done all of that, then maybe our truer selves actually sort of here for each other. And so, there's so much potential for doing that, whether it's in the outdoors or not in the outdoors, to sort of, help people move, I guess, up through some, levels of consciousness, or escape from just some of those sort of lower level patterns of thinking that, are so easy to get trapped into.
Yeah, I'm just kind of like imagining something like, for example, going back with these like super activities, high adrenaline super activities. I always kind of wondered, and maybe this is something I need to try to go research. Is that a reaction to something that our body isn't doing, or maybe our psychology is not participating in because of the more like sedentary lifestyles that we're living in, like the, Western kind of privileged world these days?
Yeah, is it kind of compensatory in some way for,
exactly.
If you're living in a sustainable kind of indigenous way, you don't need any of this, because daily life just provides for, the hunting as, some sort of peak, and, just the daily physicality of gathering enough food and, maintaining your lifestyle is more than sufficient to be an incredibly fit and active, person. So, that at least that hypothesis kind of, makes sense to me. But, essentially we're chasing a psychological experience, and that's why also, the temptation to go to drugs or, other things that are going to give you what, and I teach sort of, motivation and emotion, and we do a bit of neuropsych, and in that at the end of the day, you're probably, trying to release some dopamine into your, pleasure center in your limbic system that makes you feel good, and that's the feel good thing. If you put a rat in a cage and you put a probe into its nucleus accumbens, then it will sit there all day pushing this button, and it won't even touch food, and it'll starve to death because it's having such a good time psychologically. And that's really what addiction is sort of developing a pattern of behavior, which is like the rat pushing the lever to get this, and often people will just say, well, it's an adrenaline release, and it's not just dopamine. It's, there's a bit of a cocktail there, but essentially it's a feel-good-like experience. And we tend to then repeat, if we've had one of them, we tend to repeat the activity or seek out something similar to get a similar experience. But in that sense, you can be an adrenaline sort of junkie or something, and it's not that different from being addicted to gambling or being addicted to, a hard drug or something.
Yeah. So I'm really glad you brought up the motivation aspect. Something inside of us is motivating us, and it's these, psychological experiences, or maybe some experience that we had, or something we're chasing after, or something, we're trying to sort out. But have you done any investigation or any work for things like mental, I don't know if disorder is the right word, but for things like ADD and other kinds of disorders that are prevalent today in society, and how that connects with like motivation? Sometimes for me, it almost seems like you have the problem of almost too much motivation.
I mean, I guess I put my hand up to sort of, teach in this area when the opportunity came up, probably because, maybe what I'd love to teach would be, if I'm teaching psychology, might be positive psychology or environmental psychology or something like that. And this is probably the closest, and we have a fairly standardized curriculum. So you take what you can get. And unpacking the notion of motivation, which is thrown around, and people just sort of mostly think, well, you're either motivated or you're not. That's, or in this case, maybe you could be, overly motivated, underly motivated, or, somehow optimally motivated. But the way we sort of talk about motivation is really to say, well, every human behavior, whether it's unconscious or conscious, is driven by something. Like it's either a conscious choice or an unconscious choice. You've got an infinite number of possible behaviors. So how is it and why is it that you choose that particular behavior? And I guess that's the sort of challenge for psychological science and theory behind motivation, is to try and work out what the causes, the reasons for people's behavior. So yeah, like a manic state is, or bipolar in the manic state is an example of being, dysfunctionally motivated to the point where, you might go spend all your money or, take, poorly calculated risks and things like that. And then, one step back is sort of hypomania, which is, kind of on that edge. Like people love the state, but it's sort of right on the cusp of being functional or non-functional. And I guess maybe what I find a lot of people dream about is somehow having access to that, but still having, their hands on the wheel so that it's directed and guided. Like of all the things we used to measure at Outward Bound in terms of life skill outcomes, the measure we would use that people always rated the lowest consistently was time management. And it's probably not a typical outcome that you would expect from outdoor programs, but it does reflect the sort of old adventure will push you, you'll have 5 days in one day, and we're just going to basically overload you guys, deep end you with the volume and amount of challenges that you need to do. And therefore, managing your time better was seen as something that people could work on and get out of it. And so, but yeah, people rate that the lowest of all the life skills. And I've seen that with students too. When we do stuff, people feel quite poor about their ability to sort of allocate their time and their energy in ways that sort of fit their goals. And procrastination is this huge thing. Like it's a bit like the sort of sleep epidemic that, we're basically chronically sleep deprived. There's also this kind of epidemic of procrastination where people can't manage or don't seem to be able to manage their motivation. So to me, that's all probably just part of personal development and, a personal development kind of curriculum to be able to manage that sort of flow of energy.
Speaking of time management, I can see the clock is ticking. Just to close this out here today in the last couple of minutes, I was reading your most recent writings that you wrote in collaboration with Dorothy Foley in this article about COVID-19 and the future of outdoor education. It's kind of an article that is accessible online and it's written very transculturally. A lot of different people from around the world, from the Journal of, I think, Outdoor and Experiential Education. But in the article, it said, nothing changed and everything changed. And maybe now we need to take a hiatus to reevaluate the existential crossroads that we find ourselves at, and perhaps suggesting more Indigenous learning experiences or more Indigenous with our bodies. Can you just say, some closing thoughts about, what that might look like, or how people listening out there might be able to help to do that themselves or help others? What do you do on this hiatus?
Yeah, look, I absolutely... I'm an optimist, and that's probably come through that.
That's great.
A crisis is opportunity, really. And so it seems to me maybe we've got the opportunity for this perfect storm, which is, escalating climate crisis. COVID's come along, from my point of view, just at the perfect time, and yes, we want to solve COVID, but what if we don't get a vaccine? We get another, year or two of just slowing down and trying to live more locally and live more sustainably. And if we can, habits form over time. And so the longer we can actually live. Now, I know there's debates out there about whether COVID has had positive or negative environmental consequences. And there's, I don't want to sort of be naive to say that this is somehow the magic solution. And there's a lot of environmental scientists warning that this isn't the fix. But it does give an opportunity to sit back and think. And how else were we going to get everybody to kind of slow down? Like it's very hard to conceive. If you were God and you had to try and design something to kind of wake people up a bit, you probably couldn't have come up with a better strategy in some ways. And at least it's an opportunity to say, well, okay, can we capture the moment, capture the perfect storm, and implement some of the fundamental kind of changes that collectively need to happen in order to, live more sustainably as we go forward.
Definitely. Yeah, I share a lot of the same thoughts. It's kind of the great break in a lot of ways. I mean, of course, it was considered not for everybody, but I mean, in general, the globe is kind of taking a pause in a lot of ways right now. And I think, one very interesting thing that we see too is the level. It's really showing who can be patient and who is impatient, the level of patience, because this kind of, like you said, if we can catch the right gust of wind in this storm, it's going to require, I think, patience, because any kind of development, psychological development's not going to, paradigm shift in, individuals or global humanity is not going to happen in a few days or even a few months. It's going to take some time. Even 2 years would be pretty amazing if we could make some really big paradigm shifts about how we're interacting with each other and interacting with the environment. So, but yeah, it's an opportunity. Definitely. Definitely. Well, fantastic. James, thank you so much for speaking with me today and having this conversation. And I'm really excited to release this out to the world because I think many people out there might find this interesting. And I really hope we can get together and do this again sometime.
That'll be fun. And look, can I just say, absolutely love the initiative, the spark, the idea. I'm a bit of a podcast fan, and I have only listened to your trailer and then the first one, but in many ways that was enough for me to just go, look, you've nailed something, you're onto something. And so I think it's awesome. And thank you for doing it.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for listening, and big thanks to James for taking the time to share his thoughts and bounce all these ideas around. Now, I don't know about you, but despite all the questions I had when embarking on this conversation, I have even more now. Maybe not for James necessarily, but for myself and for you and for humanity at large. So let me know what you think. I'm talking about questions that don't necessarily have a beginning or an end or a definite answer, but as we discussed towards the end of the conversation there, they might require a physical activity. And that activity might actually be to slow down in whatever you might be doing. Slow down to relieve pressure, adjust to the situation, put at ease our energy, slow down to reflect on our actions, and keep moving in a more sustainable way. These were the Transnatural Perspectives this week, everybody. I'm your audio activity facilitator, Josh Bennett, signing off for today. Thanks for tuning in, and please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're at. Share it and enjoy it just like you do with your life now. Have a good one, everybody. Talk to you next time.